Hi, I'm Chris Cebula, and I'm here today with Mark Armbruster. We're here to address the election upcoming in November. Vice President Joe Biden says the coming election is a battle for the soul of the nation. President Donald Trump has declared this the most important election in U.S. history. There's certainly a lot of differences in their ideologies, but really, at the end of the day, does it matter that much who the next president is?
That's an interesting question. It's one that was taken up early this year in a Freakonomics podcast. Their hypothesis was that because of the separation of powers and the backstop of the courts, that the office of president is not really as important as it is often portrayed. Some of the guests interviewed on the podcast agreed with that thought process, but others said that because of the increasing popularity of executive actions, that the president was still a vastly important role.
It is clear that 4 more years under Trump would result in a presidency focused on the economy and the stock market. But we have received a lot of phone calls recently from clients who are afraid that a Biden presidency could result in a China-style ruling philosophy and a catastrophic redefinition of our economy. What have you been telling these people?
That ultimately there will be some changes under a new administration, but extreme outcomes are unlikely. The most radical policies on both sides of the aisle garner the most airtime. However, the dramatic changes in tax policy and government influence required to enact these policies would likely be rejected by a majority of Americans. We certainly can't predict what the market's knee-jerk reaction will be to the election in November, but over time, history suggests there isn't too much to worry about. Increased regulation and higher taxes would certainly weigh on business activity and economic growth. However, that doesn't mean that there'll be a disaster. We've had periods in the past when regulations were tighter and the country has experienced much higher tax rates, and yet, over time, our economic growth has been the envy of the world.
It seems every election cycle we get inundated with charts showing the historical performance of the stock market under various scenarios, such as a Democratic or Republican president, as well as the permutations for who controls Congress. Historically, though, the market has done better with a Democrat in office, so maybe a Biden victory would be good for stocks.
It's certainly possible, but I don't think the historic track record is sufficient to draw that conclusion. It is true that stocks have outperformed under Democratic presidents, but if you look a little closer, there are some anomalous periods in this data. Republicans were in office for some really nasty bear markets historically, including the start of the Great Depression, the bursting of the Nifty 50 bubble in the 1970s, and the global financial crisis in 2008. However, this is probably just a coincidence. Business cycles can certainly be influenced modestly by presidential policies, but it's a stretch to think that they alone are responsible for these events. Thinking specifically about a Biden presidency, he has advocated for additional government stimulus, and that could drive stock prices higher in the short run. Now, on the flip side, his push for greater regulation and higher corporate taxes likely would weigh on stock market valuations.
I recently found a graph on the Dimensional Fund Advisor's website that shows how stocks perform under each president since Herbert Hoover, almost 100 years ago. Interestingly, the chart shows that the stock market declined during the administrations of just 3 presidents: Hoover, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush.
Right. Stocks generally go up over time, regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. Businesses continue to operate, people strive to earn a living, and the economy grows, despite dire campaign predictions that we hear in election year ads.
Yeah, but what about the non-economic issues? Do you think the administration has more influence there?
Again, maybe in the short term, but not necessarily over time. Generally, the trajectory is that life is getting better for just about everyone. For example, living conditions for minority groups have improved significantly over time. Mark Perry at the American Enterprise Institute uses census data to show that in 1967, only about 9% of black households made $75,000 or more in equivalent 2019 dollars. In 2019, almost 30% of black households were in that category of earning $75,000 a year or more, and that was a record high. And so this may still trail behind other racial groups, and certainly much work remains to be done, but the trend is moving in a positive direction. As another example, I have a relative whose father-in-law was gay. He was also the general counsel for one of the largest public companies in America. Had he been honest about his sexuality, he would have lost his job, and it would have been almost impossible for him to find a new one. However, that was decades ago, and today there are openly gay people running for and holding public office. An openly gay person runs Apple, the largest public company in the world. And so clearly societal norms have evolved over time, making life better for diverse groups.
Is it different this time? Is it possible that what we consider normal is under attack?
History is littered with horrific events such as the Holocaust, a couple of world wars, genocides, etc. But I don't believe that we as a society are anywhere near that point, or even united enough to allow such events to occur. Also, lawsuits in the courts ultimately correct dire imbalances, as do the voters. An extreme direction, one way or the other, that results in adverse effects has generally been fixed at the polls. A platform that results in a lagging economy, for example, will frustrate voters who will ultimately oust the ruling party in favor of a new economic policy. Or a minority group feeling repressed or underrepresented will protest and demonstrate, and this has historically resulted in changes to policy and ultimately social acceptance.
The historical evidence suggests that on most fronts, economic and otherwise, we don't have to worry too much about dramatic changes to our lives regardless of the outcome of the election in November. Despite a lot of hype around this election, it seems likely most of us will continue to live much the way we do today, regardless of that outcome. We generally advise clients to separate their politics from their portfolio, as the link has been proven to be quite weak in the past. If you would like to talk further about the election or any investment-related topic, feel free to reach out. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Armbruster Capital Management's Invest Ed VidCast series.